For those who have careers that keep them out at sea for long periods of time, what is the creepiest thing you've seen out in the water? The furthest I've ever been out to sea was bay fishing, so I'm not qualified to say based on my personal experience, haha, but one story that scares the crap out of me is of a Chinese submarine that got caught in an eddy. Ocean eddies are kind of like enormous whirlpools. They can be at or below the water surface. Some are large enough to be seen from orbit. https://www.teatlantec.com/archive/2012/0to/picture-of-dash-the-date-from-orbit/to 53/15/anyway. This sub was caught in an eddy and was beginning to drift downwards towards crush depth. Obviously that's pretty scary, but what drives it over the edge to me is that the eddy was pulling them downwards in the direction of a trench. Since they're in a sub, they can't just see outside. It's almost like there was something in the trench that grabbed them and started pulling them down into the abyss. They jettisoned and eventually were able to break free before their sub was crushed and lost to dark voted forever. But the idea of your sub suddenly stopping, going in reverse against your will, and then realizing that you're headed towards an oceanic trench is just next level for me. I'm pretty grounded, but the ocean gets my imagination going. This powerful sub got caught by something and started getting dragged down towards a trench. Yeah, it was an eddy doing it, but yeesh, the imagination comes up with disturbing questions. Not so much what I saw but what I experienced. I was once underway in the Gulf of Alaska during a November gale. Waves were up to 35 feet, with some rollers hitting 45. An uncommon occurrence on the diesel-electric ship I was on was a cycloconverter tripping. When this happened, the ship would temporarily completely lose power and propulsion until some electricians could reset everything. This happened during that gale. I simply can't explain how strange it is for the boat you're on to all of a sudden go so quiet that you can clearly hear waves slapping the ship and metal bending and flexing, knowing you're completely at the mercy of the sea, knowing that if the ship lost its bearing and went beam to, there was a real possibility of capsizing. It's easy to forget when you're at sea that the only thing keeping you alive is a bunch of steel weld ed together. At that moment I was fully aware and it humbled me. Thankfully we trained frequently for this and had everything fired back up relatively quickly. Another time I recall was when the ship took a rogue wave. They are absolutely real and I believe they account for a massive number of shipwrecks. It was late at night and I was on the bridge. We were passing through a storm and were taking the waves off the bow with no visibility. As the ship moves, there's normally a pretty standard pattern. You ride up a wave for a bit and then you fall down the wave for a bit. Well, we started riding up a wave and got to the point where we should have been starting, or ride down, that we just kept climbing and climbing, and then it happened. We started our ride down the back of this massive wave. All of us braced ourselves and tried to find something to hold on to, but we all fell to the deck anyway. Anything that wasn't secured for sea fell down all around us. Manuals, tables, computers, printers, you name it. Our captain, who was sleeping, called up to the bridge asking if we hit something. It woke the entire crew up. Rogue waves are real, and they're terrifying. I can't imagine being in a smaller boat or taking one of them broadside. It's pretty hilarious that folks didn't think they were real until recently. Every time scientists stick a sensor in the middle of the ocean to detect them, they always seem to find a new rogue wave bigger than the last. They didn't think they were real because they never left witnesses some 20 years ago. On the MV Explorer Sen sunk down near the Antarctic Circle, sailing around the bergs and occasionally making landfall, we rounded into a small bay area. And there, amongst the ice and coast, was an unmarked sailing yacht, which is odd as generally yachts have some identifying markings on them. To add to it, they didn't respond to any radio contact, and whilst I wasn't privy to the conversation and it was a long time ago, some crew went across via Zodiac and were refused boarding. So basically a yacht, not a particularly large one, that was unmarked, was hanging around in the inhospitable waters of the Antarctic and didn't want any help or contact. Proper weird. Not creepy, but totally weird. To Chinese boats, like small, old, fishing vessels, meeting up in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean like half a mile behind us. This was so random, within international waters. But so freaking far away from China, I still wonder what the hell they were doing there. They had no ice. The first one to arrive close by, tasked next to us as if to check who we were and if we were keeping course sailing vessel, and then went straight towards the other ship and made it Maybe drug trafficking, or maybe just fishing. But yeah, still pretty far away from their most likely official harbor and kind of weird. It was literally in the middle of the pond, around 10 degrees north of the equator. So not your typical fishing route, those are spies. When I was in the Navy, we'd get followed by the nastiest, rustiest, most run-down and covered in bird crap fishing boats you've ever seen, until you look closer and notice all the antennae. Used to be an oilfield diver in the Gulf of Mexico. I'd say about 80% of the dives I logged were at night, mostly 500 feet and under DSBs. It's very eerie feeling sitting on the downline doing in-water decompression in the middle of night. I'd always ask topside to turn off my headlight, like a worm on a hook, just bobbing in the darkness. Now that's spooky. You ever have anything bump into you in the pitch black? I've heard a story of an oilfield diver, don't know if true. He said he once felt a current while down there and believed it was something very large that created it while swimming by. The creepiest thing I've seen has definitely been seeing myself and other crewmates lose our minds. On one particularly awful voyage, everything that could go wrong went wrong and we found ourselves without food, water, and sleep for a very unhealthy amount of time. It started off with auditory hallucinations. Ships are nosy. And when you're going crazy, you begin to think those noses are talking to you. I heard children laughing, a choir singing, and creepiest of all, a particular splash sounded like it was calling my name from the sea. Combine that with visual hallucinations and then things get really terrifying. I was convinced we were in the desert at one point with sand all around us and mountains in the distance. Another crew member freaked out and told us we were about to run into an apartment building. The creepiest thing I saw was an all-black flying pig with red eyes on the bow. I think the scariest though was when someone was convinced we lost part of our crew overboard. It turned into a massive, delirious argument over where everyone was even though we were all accounted for. That trip was brutal, and the captain put us all in a terrible situation due to sheer incompetence. Other than that, there was this one time I saw 3 gigantic ships in the distance with no lights, and they did not show up on ice. Suddenly, they were gone. It was extremely creepy. I was drinking in an airport bar and met a woman who worked as a commercial fisherman on her way to say Asia for Iran or with her family. Real salt of the earth lady. She regaled me with stories about her work, all the good stuff about working in her world, all the reasons she kept doing it for decades. I asked her what the scariest thing she saw out on the open ocean was, and without any hesitation, she said, "Oh, an underwater UFO. I saw one rise up out of the ocean next to my boat and fly off into the sky." The matter-of-factness of her answer bothers me to this day. UAPs are often associated with water and often appear in this way according to United States officials. There are tons of stories like this. Super weird, not exactly in the water, but body parts in a sea chest. The sea chest is a hole in the hull which is used for water intake. Can you explain why? Can't say for sure, but we were told that it is not uncommon for South American cartels to cut off the feet of their victims, and the last run before going into a California dry dock. Where they were found was Chile. Empty boat far out at sea. On time on an airport trip, my Uber driver was saying that he used to do security on tankers, that they would run across empty vessels more than you could possibly imagine, just floating, contents undisturbed. Wallets, photos, everything. They would hail them with no response, and, not knowing if it was a trap to get close enough to take over the ship. Pirates and ransoming the ship is apparently also more common than you'd think. Not the people though, just the cargo. Anyway, the security team would have to board the ghost ship and scope out the situation. Even yachts, when there was no one aboard, they would sink them to avoid floating strike risks. I was like, surely there is some kind of finder's fee. And he was like, who are you going to call? Probably a giant squid, well in excess of 10 meters as a conservative estimate, clinging to the bow and hull of our emergency escape vessel, which was hanging a few meters out of the water, and a few meters below where I was stood, in the depths of night, while I nipped out for a sneaky smoke. And I happened to look down at the rescue boat, and could see the shadow didn't look right in the moonlight. Stupidly, I used my phone torch. Big no-no when it's dark in ship, and scared the crap out of myself. The vessel it was wrapped around is about 15 meters long, and its tentacles were wrapped up over the gunnels 2/3 of the way down the sides. Within seconds it had detached and fell back into the ocean. I can still picture its eyeball, the size of a football, staring right at me before it dropped into the ocean. It still gives me chills now. I was in the USN back in the late 80s, early 90s, cruising through the Indian Ocean in 100% blackness, then waking up the next afternoon and looking over the rails and seeing hundreds of sharks swimming alongside of us constantly. Every now and then we would get a man overboard alert. They never recovered, even one of them at night. They were usually suicides. I read another comment from a former sailor talking about men overboard drills using a 55-gallon drum, tainted orange, and how even in the daytime the recovery rate was horrifyingly low, like 30%. People who spend days, weeks, or months at sea. What is the creepiest or most unsettling thing you've seen or that has happened out there? Two things, both off of the east coast of Tasmania on a fishing trawler, but on different occasions. One of the deckhands slipped and a fish pick went straight through his eye. I was on deck and remember happening in very slow motion. It took over 12 hours for a chopper to come and lift him to hospital. I'll never forget the screaming. 2. One night on deck, after pulling up the net, everyone could hear a man yelling. We couldn't quite hear exactly what they were saying, but they were obviously distressed. The strange thing was that we were on deck before sunset and didn't see anyone or anything else around. We called out and searched for hours. We saw and found nothing. There were no reports of missing fishermen, ships, distress signals, etc. Scared the crap out of everyone and was a very quiet trip for the rest of the week. Wait a second. Let me get this straight. The entire crew heard a man screaming. And it was none of the crew. All hands on the spook deck. It was about 11:30 p.m. We were about 200 miles away from the nearest point of land. Saw a white flare go off. I let the officer of the watch know and gave him rough bearings. Flare was no more than 10 miles away. The officer got the captain. Captain told us to head in that direction. There was nothing in that direction according to the radar, but better safe than sorry. Captain wasn't too worried as it wasn't a distress flare. Followed that path for half an hour but came across nothing, so went back to our normal course. Right before the watches swapped at 0 o'clock and right before we turned back on course, heard some whistling on VHF channel 16, normally the distress frequency, but still nothing on our radars. The captain still wasn't concerned, so we left it at that. I made a log of the events and our coordinates just in case something did happen and someone was actually lost at sea, but nothing was ever reported by the Coast Guard or any other vessel. Do you mean like a whistling sound or like a human whistling a tune? Because that would be utmost creepy. It sounded like a person whistling, but it wasn't really a tune. It didn't really last long either. Maybe 10 seconds of whistling at most yet. That's creep factor 5. I was backpacking through Panama and sailed down to Colombia on a sailboat. A day or so past the San Blas Islands, we were in open ocean. Everywhere you looked was ocean until the horizon. One night we got stuck in a bad storm, and lightning was right over top of us, and I was asleep in the bunk when lightning stuck very close to us and woke me up and scared me half to death. I went out on the deck to try and calm down as it was around 3 a.m. I found the captain out on deck looking off towards the horizon. He was staring at this black shape that we could only see, and lightning struck in the distance. He said it was probably a small island, but there were no islands in the area. I watched it really closely and noticed it was moving and fast. The shape was pitch black and I soon came to the conclusion it was a boat and not a regular boat. It was a drug-running boat. They kept all of their running light and navigation lights off to remain hidden from prying eyes. Needless to say, that was a bit unnerving, as the area is known for drug smuggling and pirates. The captain ended up grabbing the spear gun and said just make sure they keep heading north and not towards us. The Cuna Indians live in the San Blas Islands, and it is not unusual to have packages of cocaine wash up on the beaches of their little islands. In fact, drug addiction has been an issue within the tribe because of this. Imagine your coke addiction being fueled by free bags of coke you find on the beach.